Thank you. Member for Saanich North Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question through you to the Minister. Nice to be here with you in estimates. Just wondering, with respect to the $75 million that is to be dispersed here, what latitude, just kind of very general direction in the introduction here, with respect to accelerate government funding commitments for existing agreements with First Nations to support reconciliation initiatives, what kind of latitude is given the Minister to determine where those funds are going?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome to the Chair, and welcome to my colleague from Saanich North in the Islands. Thank you for the question. I think I can answer it by saying that the Ministry of Finance, working with other ministries and the Premier's office, asked us what opportunities could advance some of the key priorities of the government. So in the case of our ministry, the Ministry of Indigenous Relations, in selecting as candidates the 6 agreements that are before us, which we hope will be approved for acceleration, we looked at criteria such as the readiness of the agreement. Do they have an existing mandate? For those agreements, of course, we do. They've been around in the case of the Chislata and the others we can come to for some time. Secondly, the structure of the agreement. Can they accommodate some kind of streamlined transfers? I mentioned earlier capability of the recipients to accept accelerated payments. Are the financial systems in place to do so? And in some cases, the history of successfully accepting accelerated payments in the past. That's the case with a couple of the candidates that are before us today, in particular the Chislata, which I referred to earlier. Sorry.
I acknowledge the member from Sandwich North and Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So one of the initiatives that is underway is the initiative around Section 3 of the Declaration Act. Was it ever considered that the Minister would, instead of funding specific agreements, instead put money in place for capacity for Indigenous nations to be able to respond to the provincial government's legislative agenda by investing in the capacity for the Section 3?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Chair. And through you to the member, we had, as I said earlier, through the process I identified it, looked at criteria for selection of those agreements that met the criteria to go and find accelerated payments where warranted, and that's what we did. The issue about Section 3, which is a critically important issue, and I'm joined with me by the Associate Deputy Minister, Sisityoks Jessica Wood, who has that core responsibility for the alignment of laws contemplated in Section 3 that the member referred to, Section 3 of the Declaration Act, is certainly something that we look forward to debate when we come to the debate on the current budget, Budget 23-24, and that'll be in the coming weeks, a subject, no doubt, of the estimates debate.
Member.
Thank you. Section 3 of the Declaration Act, and I recognize for those that might not be familiar with the Declaration Act, it's in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, the government must take all measures necessary to ensure the laws of British Columbia are consistent with the Declaration. In the interim approach that was released in October of 2022, the purpose of the interim approach was a reflection of the language in the very first paragraph. The reflection of the language was to take all measures necessary. And I recognize, and I think that it's important for me to note, that the 6 nations that will benefit from the estimates that we're debating today have all significantly advanced their relationship with the provincial government to be the 6 agreements that are being considered here. And so this is not to suggest that they haven't advanced and are in a position to be able to achieve this. However, there is, I think, a situation where we have advanced as a government, the government has advanced an interim approach, and yet there are no funds available, as I can see, or at least that I'm familiar with, and maybe the minister can correct me if I'm wrong, for Indigenous leaders to be able to engage in the consultation and cooperation with the provincial government when it comes to the alignment of laws. Not only the laws that are currently on the books, but in addition, all of the laws that the provincial government is currently in the process of drafting. Why was it that this opportunity with $75 million on the, available to the minister, why was the Section 3 interim approach not considered as a very suitable source of funding for this supplementary budget estimates?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'd be the first to acknowledge through you to the member the critical importance of Section 3 and the alignment, as the member properly said, both of existing laws and bills going forward to meet our commitment under Section 3 to the alignment of laws under UNDRIP. However, what we're doing, what we were asked to do here in this deployment of the surplus, as I said, was a matter that the Minister of Finance identified that surplus, came to ministries and asked just how we might be able to meet current priorities of the government, some of the commitments that have been made, and it was our decision to use existing agreements because we had criteria that would allow us, we thought, to meet the needs of those nations with the existing agreements through acceleration. The very best agreement is the largest in front of us, which is the Cheslata agreement. And it was our belief that they met the criteria we identified and could use the funds now in a way that would meet the needs of their community to address, frankly, a tragedy that is well known in this place.
Member.
Thank you. It was, I think I articulated in the response to my first question that a choice was made. The choice was made to fund agreements that had advanced to this stage. In all likelihood, the choice, you know, to the option for government to fund those agreements, or the necessity, indeed, for the government to fund those agreements on April 1st going forward was still going to be there and still going to be available. What I'm trying to understand is the decision that was made because there is an agreement with the First Nations leaders in this province, Indigenous leaders in this province, to see this Section 3 of the Declaration Act, the inclusion of Indigenous voices and leadership in cooperation and consultation for all of the legislation that's currently being developed and legislation that is currently on the books. A decision was made that agreement was left for another day. And I recognize that the minister has a lot of needs being placed, or a lot of requests being made, and decisions that need to be made. Although nations across this province have stacks and stacks and stacks of referrals that pile up from the government, from the provincial government, from the federal government, from local governments in their neighborhoods, that they have absolutely no capacity. They've never had capacity. In fact, it's one of the great frustrations that our relatives face in communities when they're trying to address the referrals that keep pouring in. They simply have the way that Indigenous nations are currently funded under the current fiscal framework. There is no resources there to be able to actually do the technical work, to hire the technical people, to hire the lawyers to make the responses. All of that comes from taking from other budgets. And so it's curious that a decision was made to not support that process when indeed a interim approach was tabled just in October of 2022. This seems to be the perfect use of at least some, maybe not all, of the funds. And I think what this was brought to my attention, or at least I was kind of activated on this yesterday when I was sitting on a panel when the budget was being read. And it was a CBC panel. There was members from, representatives, I guess, of the three political parties, and then they brought stakeholders in and experts and asked them what they thought about the budget. One of the voices on that was Olsen. Olsen is the chief counselor of the Squamish people, Squamish Nation. And Olsen said the following: from Indigenous rights perspective, it has been a slow, challenging pathway to actually implement the UNDRIP Act, since there isn't enough resources for capacity funding for Indigenous people to participate in the legislative process. BC's framework needs to be reviewed or amended. The process is lacking since so many Indigenous people can't give meaningful input with so much legislation and consultative drafts all at once. Part of the challenge is that is not fully understood. There will be a cost to implementing UNDRIP, but a benefit as well in enabling true partnership with economic development and social development. There seems to be also, concurrently to this statement being made on public radio, in response to the budget that is, from a well-known and well-respected Indigenous leader in our province. Concurrently, there is a challenge and backlog in legislation in this House. And I think some of the things, the walls here talk. And some of the things that we're hearing is that perhaps it's because of a backlog that Olsen has pointed out. Is that indeed the case?
Minister.
Thank you very much, and through you to the member, I completely agree with the relevance of what he's saying. These issues are extraordinarily important and will be the subject, no doubt, of estimates debate in the legislature in the next few weeks and months. Today, of course, we're focused on the supplementary estimates for the 2022-2023 year and the decision to accelerate under existing government-to-government arrangements in 6 cases payments, and that I think is pertinent today. But I don't mean to suggest in answering that way to take anything away from the pertinence of what the member has said.
Member.
Is there a backlog in legislation here today because of what has been articulated in the media that there is not enough capacity funding for Indigenous people to participate in the legislative process?
Minister.
Thank you very much. At the outset of these proceedings, the chair read into the record the narrow compass of our debate today, this being a supplementary estimates process rather than a general estimates debate where I understand more wide-ranging questions are at issue. Here we were asked a question about backlog. It's not, in my judgment, I'll leave it to the chair, of course, to rule, relevant to the question that's before us, namely the allocation of $75 million in supplementary estimates to 6 specific agreements.
Member for Saanich North and the Islands, if you could help us appreciate how it is relevant to the supplement, it would be much appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would just ask you to refer back to the first response that the minister gave me. And once it shows up in the blues, I'll be able to read it directly back into the record. But in fact, the latitude that the minister articulated in his first response would indicate that, in fact, the question that I'm asking is entirely relevant. The reality is that the minister made a decision. The finance minister requested of the minister, and this is obviously paraphrasing, to come forward with some ways to spend $75 million, and the ministry made a choice. And what I'm asking about is the choice that was made. As I have indicated, I am not questioning whether or not the nations that are receiving these funds whether it's a legitimate decision or not. What I am asking about is the decision, not of the six agreements, but of the decision that was made to fund 6 agreements rather than to allocate a certain percentage of funding, considering the fact that we had on the record in public a respected Indigenous leader talking about and saying, quote, Indigenous peoples can't give meaningful input with so much legislative and consultative drafts all at once. And that, as someone who's been in this place for the last number of weeks, caught my attention, and for good reason, because we've been talking about the legislative agenda in here for the last number of weeks. And so I'm asking the minister if indeed that is the case, because I would like to, if that is in fact the case, then I'd like to know why it was that there was a decision made, even though, because we know, Mr. Chair, for those of us who have experience of living and being raised on an Indian reserve in this province, we know that the federal and provincial crown governments, municipal governments, developers, everybody involved, have expected Indigenous nations to do technical work for free. There's no revenue streams for that. There's a great opportunity with this supplementary budget process to actually provide the beginnings of a sustainable revenue stream for Indigenous peoples to stop donating their time to the provincial government. Because we've made a commitment through the Declaration Act, through Section 3 of that Declaration Act, and through an interim approach in October of 2022, that we are going to consult and cooperate with Indigenous leaders. So the reason why I'm asking is the minister basically invited this by providing the response to the first question, which was that actually the parameters were quite wide. And so if the parameters are not quite wide, if they're quite narrow, as is now being suggested, then there needs to be some clarification in that as well.
Member, my apologies. I was not here for the first part of our question, so I do ask, just based upon the relevancy of current discussion, how would you see your question fit into this supplementary specifically?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Based on the response to the first question that I asked, the minister stated that they made a decision to fund these 6. It was not made clear that the finance minister requested the minister to identify 6. Indeed, as was pointed out in the introduction to the supplementary estimates, $75 million to accelerate government funding commitments for existing agreements with First Nations to support reconciliation initiatives. And so that could be read, and I was asking the minister, we have made a commitment to, and an agreement with Indigenous people to include them in the legislative making process. And so I was asking why it was that we as a province continue to expect, essentially paraphrasing what I was saying, what my point here is, why do we continue to expect Indigenous nations to come to the table and have these negotiations and to pay their lawyers and to pay their technical people with no sources of revenue? And wouldn't this be a good opportunity with this $75 million to create such an opportunity where we stop asking Indigenous nations to volunteer their time?
Minister, if you don't mind, I will allow this question to be asked if it's okay with you. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I do appreciate the member's question and concern. It was our judgment that in supporting reconciliation commitments, as the member, the phrase that the member used, it was our judgment that accelerating payments in these government-to-government agreements would make a real life, immediate difference in people's lives, and that was at the basis of our determination.
Member.
Well, I appreciate that was a judgment call that was made by the minister. There's lots of judgment calls that need to be made by the ministry. It's a complex issue no doubt. And similar to, I think, when the bill that was before us last fall, the actual legislation that was on the table for the reform of the child welfare system. Presumably, legislation also has immediate impact on people as well, and we see an example of that. I don't know. I'm not privy to what the legislative agenda is or the legislative portfolio is that's apparently, that we've been told is coming. We were warned that it was going to be robust, and then it's proven to be less than robust. And then we have statements on the public record stating that Indigenous peoples can't give meaningful input with so much legislation and consultative drafts all at once. I'm led to believe, and some of the things, you know, as you walk down the hallways, you hear things here, that that in fact we are in the situation that we're in this House. And it just seemed to me that when we were looking at $75 million, and again, I need to reiterate, this isn't to undermine or suggest that the choices that the minister has made to fund these 6 programs, projects that are underway and have been underway, as the member from Vancouver-Langara has suggested, they've been underway for some time. So has the complete challenge that Indigenous nations have had in processing the exorbitant number of referrals that flow through their door. So are the legal costs that are that this government incurs on that Indigenous nations incur, Indigenous leadership groups incur on behalf of this provincial government's legislative agenda. Seems to me that they've been dumped in front of Indigenous people, and now we are in a bit of a legislative gridlock here. The point that I want to make, and then I'll sit down, because I recognize I'm not going to convince the minister to not do what he's doing. I recognize that, but I felt that I needed to come here and make the point that the project around Section 3 was to be consultative, cooperative, and to build a positive relationship with Indigenous nations and leaders, not to continue to do what this Crown government has done forever, which is drop an enormous number of referrals in front of governing bodies that have no resources to be able to process that. The feeling is an awful one when your territory is being cut up, is being speculated upon, is being prospected upon, and not being able to respond in a good way. Not being able to pull the technical people, not being able to pay in a good way the elders to come in and to respond. And that those referrals pile up. So it seemed like when the finance minister comes to the Minister of Indigenous Relations and said, we've got $75 million, we've got this extra budget to spend, and the legislative agenda is where it is, and the public statements are being made, and the walls in the legislature are talking, that it would have been the prime opportunity to start creating a different framework to support Indigenous nations to do the work that we've committed them to do. We've committed them to do this work. They indeed have been asking for it. But they've not been asking to volunteer. They've not been asking to take from the Elders Fund or the Youth Fund to pay lawyers to do the legal work on the referrals. That's what happens in our communities. So I recognize that it's unlikely that I'm going to convince the minister to fund a different program, and again, not to undermine or to erode the momentum that our relatives in these 6 nations have generated and have been able to once this debate wraps up and we vote collectively in favor of this initiative, that they will benefit from this greatly and deservedly. However, the point that I need to make here today is that this legislative assembly need not, as we go forward, cast any blame on the gridlock that we've achieved in this legislative agenda on anybody but on itself, this Crown institution. I do not want to hear one peep from anybody that this was because Indigenous people were not able to respond to the legislative and the technical and the policy work that's been put in front of our leaders. Because so far, from October until now, this provincial government has offered little or no resources for that technical work to actually be funded. And I can imagine that there's a lot of discussions about how it is that we're going to actually fund that work within those groups. Thank you.
Thank you, member, for sharing your concern. I do want to emphasize we are trying to stay close to a supplementary estimate as much as we can. Member from
Did the minister want to respond to that?
I'm happy to, if I may.
Minister.
Because I think that in fairness and to the eloquence that of the member for Saanich North and the Islands, I must do so. And I totally accept that there are many priorities and referrals, and the process you referred to is one that has to be addressed. I don't mean to derogate from that one bit when I say that these steps must be taken, and I'd ask him to work with me in the weeks and months to come to address the important points that he's made and that have been made by the chief of the Squamish as well. So I don't mean to, any more than he wants to take away from the importance of the work we're doing in accelerating the 6 payments, the 6 schemes that are in before us today. These are important decisions. These are important priorities, and I accept that 100%. So I just need the member to understand that. But having said that, I do think that the projects before us, these government-to-government agreements, give us an opportunity to make a difference in people's lives in the immediate term. And I would hope that that's acceptable to this House, because obviously we're here to seek approval for that decision.